Okay. Dokensei Yeshe Dorje was born to a nomadic family in the eastern region of Golok right at the turn of the 19th century. At 3 years old, he was recognized by his heart guru, the first Dodukchen, as the reincarnation of Jigme Lingpa, who had died just a few years prior. This launched him on a path to being a famed Tulku child, undergoing rigorous training as preparation for his destined career as a high lama, treasure revealer, and abbot of Dzogchen Monastery. At 18, he approached Dodukchen and made the following impassioned plea, which you have on your handout. Venerable Dharma King of unrepayable kindness, in this lifetime of yours, if you have not yet reached a decision regarding my career, I am certain that holding the position of an abbot would cause me to violate Samaya to my Vajra brothers and sisters, generate anger and malevolence towards sentient beings, and accumulate and hoard food and wealth. Such things are certainly causes for taking rebirth in a lower realm. If you were to grant me this permission with your great loving compassion, I will accomplish my service to you for the duration of this life with tantric practice. Please allow me to dispense with the burden of monasticism and thus approach the observance of such yogic practice. Please, I pray to you 1,000 times, declare my permission to wander the kingdom aimlessly. If, perchance, and for whatever reason this does not please you, then this would be like practicing the sacred Dharma without the Guru's instruction or consent. Like sprout covered in frost, it will bear no fruit. Not to mention the possibility of obtaining awakening. This is nothing but the cause of hell, so even if I have to murder 100 people at once, I would never violate your command, Venerable Dharma King of threefold kindness. I'm going to return to that in a second. Over the last 40 years, feminist and feminist-inspired Tibetologists, many of whom are at this conference, have done enormous work to reveal Buddhist tropes of womanhood and femininity. This has involved illuminating the social, historical, and religious contexts of those tropes, their evolution in literature, and their reflection of and impact on actual Tibetan women. Feminists importantly center women as the primary site of analytical and scholarly inquiry, which means that so far, very little Tibetological attention to gender has revealed men as equally gendered subjects, with the exception of a monograph from one of my esteemed panelists. I think the field is ripe for us to extend the richness of feminist insight into the domain of Tibetan Buddhist men and masculinity, to ask how gender shapes the embodied lives, historical trajectories, and religious possibilities of discrete men as men. This will require a critical masculinities method. Here I'd like to offer some provocations about how that might look in a Tibetological context, and use them to think very briefly about this quote from Dokensei. As so many of the talks that we have been gifted with hearing this weekend has emphasized, narratives of our ancestors, role models, foremothers, forefathers have an enormous impact on our sense of possibility, on our imaginative horizons of who we can or even ought to be. Narratives matter. They tell the truth, sometimes even by lying. Just as so many of the women here have been desperately seeking women, foremothers, ancestors, and role models, I too have been desperately seeking my own Buddhist forefathers and healthy, sane, compassionate role models. They're lacking. As a scholar interested in Buddhist masculinity, I think we need to read against the grain of Buddhist narratives in which men are conspicuously unmarked. This means reading narratives for the information they contain about men and masculinity within a diverse array of literary genres, historical time periods, geographic regions, and choluk, schools. We need to consider the material, political, religious, and cultural conditions of men's lives as men, and interrogate how those conditions inform a text's production, guide its circulation, and shape its reception history. What versions of manhood are highly emulated and widely circulated, and which are denigrated, mocked, or castigated? What kinds of men fade to the background in a narrative without remark, and what makes them so unnoticeable? What were the economic, political, and cultural conditions surrounding this kind of attention in narrative? As a queer man, I'm particularly interested in the ruptures between gender as an embodied enactment, sort of being a man, as a social ideology or masculinity, or what it means to be a man, manliness, and in the Vajrayana as a religious principle, or the masculine. So how are there ruptures between these things? How do they not all fit seamlessly together? When we're looking within a particular context, say a namtar or other kind of narrative, part of what makes masculinity so difficult to analyze is the many ways that it cloaks itself, that it disguises itself, discursively, ideologically, in representation. While womanness is highly marked and self-reflexive, maleness is rarely marked and normatively unattended. Buddhists have been grappling with, writing about, and arguing over the relationship between femininity and soteriology or liberation for millennia. But just because they haven't been naming or marking masculinity in the same way when talking about men's liberation does not mean that men's maleness is not related to the liberation. I submit that masculinity has lurked under the surface for just as long. It's just not named that way. Just because it's not thematized and articulated doesn't mean masculinity is less operative in Buddhist life, or indeed the path to liberation. And here we return explicitly to Dokensei's impassioned plea to his guru. Please, let me adopt the conduct and practice of a wandering yogi. Let me not step into the role of a monastic abbot. A critical masculinities analysis of this passage would note the affective charge, the emotional charge of this text. Dokensei worries that a life bound to a monastery would feel anger and resentment festering in him like an open wound. It would lead him to even kill hundreds of people at once. Critical masculinities analysis would also query the relationship of the male guru and the male disciple. How is power brokered and negotiated between men whose connection stretches across lifetimes, whose bond is tied to the capacity to liberate you from suffering? The stakes of this relationship are really high, indeed as high as a Buddhist could possibly imagine, since the Vajrayana leads but two destinations. There's a lot more to say about affect and relationships in this passage, but what I'm particularly drawn to here as I close is the contrasting versions of religious manhood that Dokensei presents. The stationary abbot, who offers empowerments, takes on disciples, and interfaces with the lay community, versus the wandering yogi, engaged in a variety of sexy, subversive practices, bound to no one and free to wander wherever he wants. While women's gender has been consistently and nauseatingly dissected in Buddhist traditions for millennia, what about men's gender as it relates to their liberation? The distinction between the monastic scholar and tantric yogi is well-worn ground in Tibetology, noted pervasively as early as Giuseppe Tucci's time. But the provocation I want to offer here is this. Just as womanhood has been explicitly queried in relationship to liberation, so too has manhood, but without calling it manhood. The privilege of patriarchy allows these masculine negotiations to masquerade as simply human. But the routes to liberation pursued by the celibate monk and the tantric yogi are distinctly gendered routes. They are legible types of religious manhood. I identify unapologetically as a feminist scholar. I take that to mean that I am committed to doing what I can to support the liberation of women from their oppression specifically, and the liberation of all of us from the oppression of toxic gender regimes more broadly. I see my small part of that work as naming what has gone unnamed, as marking what has gone unmarked. In the midst of that work, I am also searching for my own forefathers, my own Buddhist ancestors, who can help me on my own faltering path to waking up. Thank you.
Hey, hi everyone. So my name is Kevin Buckelew, and I am an assistant professor of Chinese Buddhism here at Northwestern. I think my presentation is the only one featuring a translation from Chinese, so hopefully you can bear with me, and I will sort of try to facilitate connections with the larger themes in Tibetan Buddhism in the conference. So I just want to, before I go into this translation, my book project is about Chan Buddhism in the Song Dynasty, Chan also known as Zen in Japan. And the Song Dynasty is when Chan became really big, and it became a really powerful elite institution made up of a bunch of lineages of people who had been selected to join lineages. And then people who had been selected to join those lineages had privileged access to monastery abbacies. So members of Chan lineages became extremely powerful during the Song Dynasty. So that's sort of the period that I'm focusing on. I wanted to sort of tell a brief story about how I came to be interested in the question of masculinity in Song Dynasty Chan Buddhism and gender in Chan Buddhism in general. When I first got to graduate school in, I think, 2008, one of the very first classes I took was with Professor Junfang Yu, who was my advisor, called Women in Chinese Buddhism. And up to that point, gender had not really been on my academic radar. I had taken a class on Chan as an undergraduate. That professor did not assign any readings about gender. And so I took this class not really knowing what to expect and sort of thinking like, my advisor's teaching this class, so I'll take it. And as you might imagine, I sort of, like, my mind was blown by this class, and it really changed the way that I thought about the study of Buddhism. And in that class, I read several articles that were specifically about Chan, women in Chan, that were written during this time of great vibrancy for the study of Chan Buddhism in the early 90s by scholars like Dinghua Xie and Miriam Levering, who drew attention to we have a sort of a very small number of records of women participating in Chan Buddhism in the Song Dynasty, and these scholars sought out those records and recovered the voices of these women who participated in Chan. Compared to the entire archive of Chan Buddhism from this period, it's a very small amount of material. But through analysis of that material, they demonstrated something that I think other scholars had basically totally missed, even though Chan is so well studied. It had been studied in Japan for many, many decades. And people hadn't evidently noticed, scholars hadn't noticed, that Chan Buddhists in the Song Dynasty routinely describe the ideal Chan master as a great man. The Chinese is Da Zhang Fu. So these scholars, Levering and Xie, for example, analyzed how the women who were participating in Chan had their sort of participation shaped by this expectation that the ideal Chan master should be a great man. And so they showed explicitly examples where you see women being said to be exceptional if they succeed because they're sort of honorary great men, right? So you'll have these Chan masters say, like, this person is a woman, but she acts like a great man, or she's fulfilled the expectations of great manhood. There's one record that's so striking where a woman embarks upon a Chan career, something that all the Chan students are described as doing, where they call upon different Chan masters to see who they will sort of click with. And a Chan master says to this woman, "What are you, a delicate lady of the inner quarters, doing embarking on this great man's affair?" So it's just a really in your face, if you are reading it, that gender is at issue here. And one of the things that I was sort of most impacted by Miriam Levering's article, it's actually a book chapter in Jose Capizon's 1992, I think, volume that everyone knows, Buddhism, Sexuality, and Gender, that basically says these Chan masters were committed to the idea that gender is illusory and it's not essential to the realization of liberation. They said that, at least some of them did. They explicitly said gender doesn't matter. And yet the very same Chan masters would then say, if you want to do Chan, you have to be a great man. And to be a great man, it means to be bold and decisive. They have all these kind of language of what Levering calls the rhetoric of heroism. So basically Levering says there's a tension here in these materials. She's just looking at a few Chan masters. There's a tension between the rhetoric of heroism, revolving around this term great man, Da Zhang Fu, and the rhetoric of equality, she says, which is basically the rhetoric of everyone can get liberated. So this sort of stuck in the back of my head over the course of my graduate study. I changed my dissertation topic 1 million times. And then at some point I was like, I'm going to do Chan, I think, still. And it sort of came to me in a flash that Levering had really hit upon something that's so important to the study of Chan Buddhism in general during this period. But that, amazingly, incredibly, the field outside of these scholars, these pioneering scholars of women in Chan, had not registered. In the predominantly male field of the study of Chan, it just didn't seem like people were really taking that to tell us anything except that, yes, we have a very small handful of records about women, and that's great that they did that, that's nice. And so it recovered, but there wasn't a sense that this tells us something that we all need to know about Chan, what men need to know about Chan. So I became interested in this question of it tells us, also about masculinity. When they keep saying, Da Zhang Fu, you need to be a great man, they're articulating a particular ideal of masculinity. And it's not just like great man, that just means masculinity. There are very specific tropes attached to the vision that they have of what the great man should be. So in the course of my research, that sort of jumped off from Levering's piece and other work by Dinghua Xie, for example, and Beata Grant works on this in the late imperial period. I discovered that Da Zhang Fu is sometimes used. It's used fairly often in Buddhist scriptures in Chinese translation to translate the Sanskrit word Mahapurusha, which is great man, right? It's also used in all kinds of medieval Chinese literature to talk about heroic generals or heroic government ministers who risked their lives in service of the state. So I came to realize that Chan Buddhists, when they invoked great man, they were often in a way that if you sort of look at these two kind of etymologies or like source reference points for the word Zhangfu, they're sort of weaving together a Buddhist vision of the Mahapurusha and a Chinese vision of the ideal great man who's either a general or a minister. And quite often it's a general, not a minister. In other words, Chan literature is filled with tropes of martial masculinity. This scholar, Cam Louis, has argued that in pre-modern China, rather than thinking about yin and yang as the most important sort of like trope for talking about gender, we should think about civil and martial, which organized this sort of spectrum of masculinity for elites that was available as like an ideal. And so one of the things that struck me was the Song Dynasty has often discussed, and Song Dynasty Chan has been discussed by scholars as being a period when the sort of interest in martial stuff faded away, and there was more poetry, more culture. The sort of center of gravity of China shifted to the south, where there was like poetry, culture, and stuff. So it's like, why are they doing all this like military imagery in their writing? Obviously, it's telling us something that would have been appealing, I think, to men as a vision of manhood and as a vision of a sort of set of dispositions that predisposed one to attain liberation decisively in this like awesome way, right? So this is just one, like the first 4 lines of a poem titled "The Song of the Clashing Swords of Chan Generals." That gives an example of how this kind of worked. So I'll just read it very quickly. It says, when the swords of Chan generals clash, in other words, Chan masters that are being cast as generals, military generals battling each other, watch to see who is the master. Okay, so sorry, before I go any further, let me just say very quickly, I think that this poem is about the situation of encounter dialogue between either two Chan masters or Chan master and disciple. And there's a sort of thing in the study of Chan that everyone knows. Chan encounter dialogues are often characterized as battles for sort of to see who's going to be the victor. Right. I don't think that scholars have really explained like why were they doing that? Why is that the framework? You know, in earlier periods or in other Buddhist traditions in China, no one is talking about everyone fighting each other to figure out who's liberated. So I partly want to figure out just why that is the language that they go to. Okay, I'll keep reading this. So it says, it's just like the Tang Dynasty General Yu Chi Jingde encountering rival Koguryo, that's like Korea, right? General Jin Ya. The blades of their wit move quickly, and it's difficult to discern who is who, moving horizontally and vertically, alternately capturing and releasing. It's no use for either side to try to exaggerate their wisdom, like in the heat of this amazing, evenly matched battle between two Chan generals. So this is just the first 4 lines. It's a longer poem, but one of the things that this poem does is it weaves together Chinese reference points for sort of great manhood. The term great man is not here, but this is adjacent to a lot of stuff where they do use that term. Yu Chi Jingde was a historical general from the Tang Dynasty. I think that this guy, Jin Ya, is a made-up Korean like villain general that was probably from a story that's lost, but we have a little bit later, we have stories of that look like it's these two generals fighting. So obviously that's a Chinese sort of like literary reference point for military valor. But then as the poem goes on, there's a lot of stuff about wielding the sword of wisdom. You know, there's plenty of martial imagery in Buddhist scriptures to fill out this vision of the Chan master as a great man who's simultaneously martial in the way that the Buddha or that a bodhisattva like Manjushri is martial, and also martial in the way that a heroic Chinese general would have been martial. So as Joshua was saying, I think that this is something that I think male scholars just haven't noticed because they're like, yeah, whatever, it's just like stuff they're doing, you know. And I think that we can actually spell out this is engaging with a discourse of masculinity that was ongoing in medieval China, and it allowed Chan Buddhists to enter into this conversation, an elite conversation among elite Chinese men about what does it mean, how should an elite Chinese man act, you know. And they were having their say in a way that I think Buddhists in previous generations of Chinese Buddhism hadn't done. So there's clearly a lot of power in that kind of rhetoric to allow Chan Buddhists to enter into conversations about masculinity with basically literati. Probably very few of them were like serving in any kind of military context. So obviously it just seemed cool. I mean, it's not obvious, but there must have been some kind of appeal of martial masculinity, even to people who were not, literal soldiers or generals. So just in terms of translation, I think there just hasn't been enough attention paid to the specific tropes out of which these ideals of Chan mastery were constructed, and the way that those tropes can be demonstrated to participate in the larger discourse of masculinity. And to me, it seems like doing that allows us to see that gender was at issue in places where we didn't know before, or scholars hadn't analyzed before in Chan. So I think that's all I will say. Thank you.
We surface a set of questions between us. And these are not intended to be didactic in any way, but also, and so what I mean by that is that if there are things that are alive for you after hearing our presentations, we want this to be a dialogue with everyone else in the room. So some of the questions that emerged for us as we were talking in preparation for the panel is, how is masculinity studies a feminist endeavor? What does it mean to mark the unmarked? And that's also we think of that as a translation question too. Where do we find signs of masculinity? Where do they reside? And then I think Professor Makley made such a powerful case for what are the stakes of finding them, and who is finding them, and who are they legible to, and in what places and times. How to position masculinity vis-a-vis liberation. That could be nationalist liberation, soteriological liberation, martial liberation. And how can we extend gender analysis beyond the human? So this is actually something that emerged in our conversations, but not in our presentations today, thinking about non-human animals, deities, land deities, entities, gods, demons, and the ways that those also inflect gender practice and the ways that people think about their gender. So those are some high-level questions, or looking down on our conversation. But again, we really would love to hear from the rest of you.
Now?
Yeah, please.
Well, I haven't spoken out about each one, but since this is most recent and it's still in my memory, and it doesn't really answer your questions, but I did a couple of notes about it. One is that thing of scolding monks is just total common. That they have to do that. I saw Sakya Townsend recently this summer really berating the Tibetan community. He does that in Tibetan, and he always translates his own talks. And then, but when he translated into English, that wasn't there.
Yeah,
It was not there. But the other thing I want is, I think the oral and the written are totally different worlds. And I recorded, a very great Tibetan teacher, and and then I transcribed it word for word, and I showed it to him to, make corrections, and he said, I didn't say that. Because he would never write it like that. There's rules for writing. There's such a thing about Buddhist advice.
Yep.
And so I don't know. I don't think probably it would be good to transcribe and do all the emotional thing, because if you're going to put it in writing, they wouldn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
The speaker wouldn't like that. They wouldn't want that to be a lot, anyway, a lot like when I talk. I don't want that written down. But anyway, that is just some observations from some experience. It doesn't quite answer the question of masculinity and aggression.
Well, sorry. No. I think that this actually does tie into masculinity really deeply, because I think about so much of the tenderness that has emerged this weekend around women's articulations of sexual harm and abuse, and that's also something that men are not wanting anyone to talk about.
Well,
right?
of course, yeah.
And so I think we also need to query where is the resistance coming? I think the ethical obligations and duties become really sticky really quickly when we're thinking about what are the motivations for keeping things silent. Or what does it mean to put something in word, to articulate something as gendered, right? I encounter resistance to masculinity work so often, and I think that a huge part of that is because it's ruining the game, right? It's oh, well, you're ruining the fun of it, just being no one's noticing. Why are you noticing this?
Yeah.
Right.
If you're going to say it, we're going to write it. Yeah, it's a good point.
That's one reaction that I have.
Yeah, one of the stakes, though, if you think about non-Western folks, people who are ensconced in Tibetan Buddhist worlds, what does it ruin? What can it ruin? It's not ruining fun always, but it can be ruining that sense of a reputation, but also sacred kind of reverence and deference relationships to lamas and chukos. So I think you're right that gets edited out in the writing for lots of reasons.
Lots of reasons.
There's so much prestige to the written language. It's very embedded in Buddhism. Yeah. But the Panchen Lama is a kind of idiosyncratic figure because he straddles so many boundaries. So when I see him transcribed, people will transcribe almost word for word some of his pretty harsh speech. And he was very out in saying, I speak straightforward, I speak in this way. And so people would literally go to his talks and transcribe in the best way that they could in Tibetan and Chinese. So, I don't know, they might have felt they had the imprimatur to do that because he was this like really unprecedentedly, out there person, in part because he felt like he was battling for high stakes.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So it may be different for him. I don't know, but I think there are still those stakes here, especially for folks who really highly revere him and would not want him diminished in any way.
Yeah.
Charlene, following up on Sarah's question, you documented really well how the transcription altered the original greatly and involved some bowdlerization or at least interpretation to a high degree. And this is a panel on masculinity, so I see how you're highlighting that. But would you say that your, like Apo, for instance, was more concerned to alter the record about the Panchen Lama's marriage and children more than this? I mean, so this is a concern of ours today, but was the bigger issue for your interlocutors the marriage?
Yeah, in a way, right? But the concern is also to represent his well-known kind of penchant. Like he hit people when he felt like people were not being righteous. Like he would slap people, and so there would be a sort of step back from sort of representing in crude terms. He hit somebody, so there was sort of an elevating of those events. But I think, no, the marriage was way more problematic. So there are also gender sexuality issues there, because that's also the dalok notion of falling, right? And then also not being able to speak about the coercion there, like that it wasn't fully his choice. He kind of embraced it as a way to make it nice, to also try to affirm that he could be out of prison. So that right after he got out in the early 80s, there were some indications that he could have been put back under house arrest. So he had to, and he wanted permission to go tour again, to return to his home regions, get back to Dachi Lumpo, for example, but also Langdo. So I haven't really, there's so much to me that's kind of grotesque around all that I haven't delved. I've kind of stayed away myself.
Sure. What about when you compare the way that the speech has been transcribed to written accounts in the traditional literature about lamas being fierce? There's the monks and they're goofing off at a puja and picks up the dorje and throws it across the room and knocks them in the head. That kind of thing is written about pretty openly, at least in some Tibetan Buddhist circles. So it'd be interesting to compare.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned Michael Lambert's book, who talks about that very thing.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
That kind of thing. But it's still, I don't know, maybe in my limited engagement with Tibetan Buddhist literatures and stuff, I have not seen a lot of that in mainstream literature or in sutras or in tantras. Maybe.
Guru Rinpoche was pretty violent.
Yeah.
Killed some people, bound them, did all kinds of things.
All the stuff about taming.
There's a scene in Khyentse Wangpo in Kongtrol where we're dealing treasure and there was so much violence going on about like subduing the Naga so that it could get the treasure from the lake. And on the way back down the mountain, Khensi Wangpo was just throwing rocks at people and hitting them really hard, and everyone said, "Oh, how wonderful! Everyone who got hit by a rock got enlightened." So it's like his wrath was known and celebrated, and it was part of his. It was part of his whole mystique around him.
Yep.
I think it's a warrior culture, basically.
Yeah. No, I've written about that before too.
Oh.
But it's just that. It's like, that happens. Maybe in real life, someone gets hit by a rock thrown by the Lama. But how does it end up being contextualized? How does it end up being talked about later in the version of this kind of split subject of someone who pivots between mundane and transcendent dharmic worlds? If you have the authority to do that, you can get away with it and have it be seen to be enlightening. Oh, I was touched by something that.
Right.
But just back to sort of other ordinary men or women, those who are seen as women, don't necessarily have access to skillful means like that in terms of being recognized as having.
Interpreted as skillful.
Yeah.
Yeah, or getting away with it.
Yeah, just getting away with it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, these narrative accounts deeply impact the ways that people think that, like role models, right? Like, and what it means to be skillful. I mean, skillful means is like famously gendered male,
Yeah.
right? Like on a metaphysical level.
Yeah.
Conjola, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I was just curious about this passage that you shared with us. I think it's really fascinating. Actually, two things, which is, your reference to this issue of different masculinities for monastics versus tantric yogis. And I mean, we have like a little bit of scholarship about that, but not much. And so I just wonder how you're seeing that in your text, with these really drastic statements. Let me dispense with the burden of monasticism and approach the observance of yoga. If I'm an abbot, I'm going to be a really bad one and be mean towards people and hoard food and wealth. I mean, it's such a critique of monasticism, and so, I'm wondering what in this work that maybe you're just starting in it, I don't know, but what's the kind of different masculinity? Would you say it is about the martial thing because we're saying that and wanting to murder people, or how are you talking about those differences?
Yeah, I mean, so this difference, there's a really famous story that's circulated orally and in literature about Dokensei and Patrul Rinpoche. I don't know how many of you know it, the old dog, how he got his name, Old Dog. Yeah. Right, so I presented this, and I actually published an article on this about how Dokensei is so the story when he meets Patrul Rinpoche, he's able to clairvoyantly know that Patrul Rinpoche is thinking to himself, "Oh, the evils of alcohol. Even like such an accomplished master like Dokensei can succumb to the power of drinking." Dokensei reads his thoughts. Patrul Rinpoche smells alcohol in his breath, and then he just grabs Patrul Rinpoche by the hair, throws him against a tree, and just beats the shit out of him. Leaves him under the tree. And is like, how dare you think that you have any kind of enlightened view because you have you're still bound up in right and wrong, and then spits on him and calls him an old dog and walks away. And Patrul Rinpoche is like, oh my God, that was a mind transmission. And then he sits under the tree that he was just beaten against and attains full awakening, and then identifies that as his. And so the entire story is setting up this contest between the sort of restrained, Vinaya-abiding monastic scholar with the tamed masculinity, and then the sort of wild yogi who has access to these skillful means because of his realization. And this is one of the things that I translated as yogic praktulshuk, this term that's really complicated. So Khandrila, this summer I had many conversations with Khenpo Tutumla.
Praktulshuk, I'm really stuck on how people translate this term.
So, and Khenpo was like, this term is huge, it's vast, right? That it's a really, really complex term that does not have one straightforward translation. And that one of the things that's so crucial at this is that it's not only understood as conduct that you do to demonstrate your awakening, but also conduct you do to catalyze your awakening, right? That it's both. It's this practice, it's performative in that way, in the Austin or Butlerian sense that it's performative, that it generates itself. And that's available to a certain kind of male figure. I think one of the things that I constantly kind of pose to myself is if you were to switch this and make this a woman, would this story be believable? Would people if a woman master were to throw rocks at someone, these questions that are alive around what is it, how is this accessible to men? and not to women, and what kinds of men. And so I think that this goes all the way back to Milarepa, right? Like, Milarepa has this famous contest with many different showdowns with the geshes, right? The sort of like the abbots, the people that hold monastic seats, when he sort of shows off either his superior awakening or his superior knowledge. And then there's like the whole kind of contest between, is it Bari Lotsawa? Who's the one that's near the end that tries to kill him? Geshe.
Yeah.
Geshe Bari. Geshe Bari?
I was going to say there's a whole genre of stories that start with one time a geshe and a yogi.
Yeah, right, exactly. Right. These are tropes of manness, right? These are like tropes of like religious masculinity that are constantly competing with each other for centuries in Tibetan literature about who can get enlightenment better and faster.
Yeah, it's a never-ending question.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's the one with Patramche and the geshe where he just shows his penis?
Oh yeah. Well, and Drukpa Kunle also does. There are like a couple of like revealing the penis things, right? That like, I mean, David de Valeria wrote about that in the Holy Mandate, but like didn't pause to reflect on like, oh, this has something to do with like gender somehow, right? Like, because then also famously he whips out his penis and is like running around women chasing like, let me fuck you, and then inverts it and then chases after men and is like.
Penis as pedagogy.
Reminds me of LBJ.
Skillfully?
Can you just say that story for like 1 minute, a little bit more expansively for people who haven't read it, who are listening to this conversation? Yeah, like what do you mean by that? Showing your penis, and where does it fit in a story? Like just a couple of sentences more about how that shows up in a Buddhist text.
In his namtar, yeah. In his namtar, this is a scene that. So I think it's Sangyong Haruka who does the penis reveal, not Drukpa Kunle.
Drukpa Kunle did that constantly in the folk version. So.
But is the reference point the Buddha? Is it supposed to be like the Buddha?
But I mean, he's like the jester figure, the clown.
Yeah.
The Nyingpa?
He's the clown.
Narrative.
Yeah.
I just say it reminds. I mean, this is not Buddhist studies related, but in Texas, we talk. LBJ went to Texas State, he would take out his apparently very large penis in conversation and like pee in front of men.
Oh my God!
They weren't doing what he wanted to do. Is this like power move?
That has nothing to do with gender.
Yeah.
So then this comes back to a question I think, Charlene, that you were posing around like. I find myself really grappling with the difference between like explicitly gendering something versus like naming and making explicit the gender that's already there, right? The gender that's like on the ground, like that. Those feel like distinctions to me, and to name something that's diplomatically unnamed feels like a different thing than carving something out or like laying something on that's actually not even there in the first place. Those feel like different operations to me.
Like great man is so much clearer in that way, and the honorific great man, it's being explicitly rendered in a way that's referring to sex and gender. And so what would you say, Charlene?
I guess what I'm trying to say is that when we gender things in English, we are bringing with that a whole system of understanding and critique about categories of sex, gender, and sexuality. So one of the things I would say is what I've tried to do in my own work is I try really hard to keep my own categories at bay, and it's really, really hard to do, but to try to listen from the ground up for people's own notions of relationships between things that we would deconstruct as sex, gender, and sexuality. So, you're seeing Jiangfu, this kind of, what is the word, just great Jiangfu?
Yeah, Jiangfu.
Is that a gender term? Is it, you'd have to sort of have a larger context to understand whether they're actually recognizing bodies, marks on bodies. What are marks on bodies? So that's what I mean by signs of masculinity or signs of maleness. Are we seeing claims about sex, which I just sort of gloss as types of marked bodies? It doesn't have to be penises. vaginas, these kinds of things, but it could be a certain kind of mark that only males are supposed to have at the time, blah, blah, blah. So how are people being marked off as different according to the category system? So when you have Da Zhang Fu, what are the other categories that it's engaging with? Right. So starting there for me, versus sort of, here I come with my feminist analysis, and then sort of noticing the hierarchies and things and suggesting. But that aside, that's all there, and I've done that in my violence liberation book. I was like, yes, masculinities are there. What about when you are interacting with differently positioned people in the moment? So the different readers of these texts, or my collaborators who have different stakes in them. When is bringing your English language gender analysis to that mix appropriate? And then I'm situating myself. Appropriate as a white American woman, educated in a certain way, and a dominant English speaker. When is that appropriate? And when do I step back and not bring all that? So that's what I'm grappling with. So, we search for role models and we want to find things for ourselves in them, but that might be a very different search for somebody who is a disciple of a lama or a yogin or something. So it's just sort of noticing that potential gap and being very humble about it, I guess. Because I was a graduate student, I was like, oh, feminist anthropology. I was like, men are masculine, like men are gender too, and this is all about masculinities. But there was a huge gap between my agenda and folks there in LeBron where I was. They weren't necessarily thinking about those things then. They, and yet there was all sorts of conversation and critique about how Tibetan women were being treated, Tibetan nuns were being treated. So but they might have a different type of analysis using different categories, I guess. So that's all I'm saying. It's just sort of having a little bit of that. Maybe, and we've heard this about sort of local theories or local ontologies, right? Taking those as a starting point of the critique rather than where we would start, maybe. So.
Yeah, speaking of local ontologies and categories, Joshua, you just said that the monk versus yogi thing is about competing masculinities. And of course, the issue of the conflict between the monks of the forest and the monks of the city, that goes way back to the earliest Mahayana. So can you say a little more about what these two competing masculinities are? And if that's your category or if that's a Buddhist category, I mean, more likely, our categories, but define the two competing masculinities for us, please.
Yeah, well, I don't.
Or characterize them. Maybe not define them.
I don't know that I think of them as my categories, as much as so many stories begin with like a geshe and a yogi, right? And that sets up, that sort of invokes an entire history of literature, right? That brings to the table sets of real expectations that are about what they're going to do, right? Like how they're going to interact with one another, the way they're going to be positioned together. Mm-hmm. And I'm not as much saying this is about masculinity as the masculinity is bound up in a network of a bunch of things, right? Like class, education, language, body, ability, height, body, like all of these things that are like a bundle of things that show up together and then influence the horizon of possibilities of ways that characters act in the world. The things that they say to one another, and that also the intervention I'm really interested in making, because a ton of people say that about masculinity. The thing that I'm really interested in is how is that related to liberation, right? Like I think that the thing that feels really crucial to me is that these are the stakes is like waking up out of samsara, and if these are about that this is also bound up in gender, that it's not just like women are the only ones that are dealing with gender when it comes to liberation. Like that's also a thing that's like deeply negotiated for centuries with men and ways of being a man and what's expected of you. Joey, I just saw.
Oh, you can finish speaking.
Yeah.
I'm also writing down yours. You good?
I'm good. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. And I also saw that Jan was good.
Liberation. Actually, I was inspired by Kevin's talk, and if I understood correctly, and my memory serves me right, this literary versus martial masculinity started as a, let's not use Confucianism, but secular trope we see in Chinese history, and started to be you see that seeping into the gender ideal in Chan Buddhism. I was wondering if it'll help with Joshua for you to think about secular masculinity and masculinities, because I can think of Andong masculinity being different than Central Tibetan, and I'm sure there's multiple valence at play there, and to see how that interrelates with Buddhist masculinities and all those different tropes you were talking about.
Totally. So this is I just pitched a Fulbright application for a dissertation that's thinking about how might it be actually that the trope of the wandering siddha is available as a religious pathway for Dokensei to navigate the competing, maybe not necessarily competing, but the expectations of manliness that adhere to him as a Golokpa, right? So he's from Golok, like famously violent, so martial masculinity, banditry, warfare, but then identified as a Tulku, and his father is Nyanchen Tangla, one of the most famed and powerful mountain deities from central Tibet. So if he's a Tulku, how can he sort of navigate the gendered expectations that fall on piety as a religious figure, but also like a Golok man? And so part of my argument is, this pathway of the please let me do this, please let me not be an abbot and go out and do this practice, is a gendered route to liberation that is legible not only as a Golok man, but also as a Tulku. That it's like this path that's available to him via secularity, like this sort of secularly legible. There's a very, very beautiful scene in his Namtar when Doju Chen identifies him as Jigme like his reincarnation, and his uncle, his paternal uncle, his father's brother shows up, and he's like, nobody is going to take my nephew away. My Katsawo is not going to be taken away from our Dewa and installed as a Tulku, because our patriline, all the way from the archer down, we are warriors, we drink the blood of our enemies, we are not interested in religious practice. You're not going to take him away and put him, it's much better for him to be a military commander, to kill all of our enemies, to eat their flesh and drink their blood, than to fly through the sky like a bird. Right, that's his he's mocking city, right? Mocking Buddhist practice.
Not to mention that path of the wandering yogi is not an option for most women.
Yeah, right.
It's dangerous. So it is already a masculine thing.
Right, already, from the beginning. Yeah, right.
Can I just jump in and sort of do the obvious that ordination is emasculating, right? I mean, it's just, doesn't it?
That's what I was gonna.
Right, and so it's curious, that to talk about competing masculinities between it just seems obvious that the wandering yogi would be the man, and the effete lama would can't compete with that. But then I think of your example of the Panchen Lama. That's really interesting. You would think that people would be like, yeah, our Panchen Lama, he's got a wife, he's got kids, he's virile,
Interesting, yeah.
right? But they want him to be, so I see that as sort of really sort of mixed up, and I guess competing masculinities is right, because they want him to be a Lama, the pure, the Tuku, who is a man, and yet emasculated.
This is what I grappled with in the book too. It's what do you make of monasticism and the bodily changes you're supposed to go through in order to claim that status? Both female-bodied people and male-bodied people do it, right? Androgyny. Right. So it's a certain kind of performative androgyny. You literally shave hair. Hair is one of the most gendering, sexualizing markers. So it seems to me to encapsulate this incredibly deep tension that Kevin mentioned about heroic martiality, but also this ethos of Buddhist equality, but also the emptiness of all distinctions of humans. You're supposed to actually transcend lay life and householder life into monastic life. So is it degendering? Is it supposed to actually be a degendered status? And the hope of it, the aspiration of it, is that you leave behind the limits, the sex-gendered sexual limits of your lay life. And you devote yourself to the Dharma, and you're on a path of enlightenment. So in that ethos, a female-bodied person should have equal access, should be equally, right? But that's not the case in practice. So it's this huge tension in Buddhist traditions of that kind of authoritative mainstream notions of enlightenment as transcendent of gender, sex, sexuality, versus historical realities like we all know in the Vajrayana, like you're talking about, and in Chan even, of deeply gendered sexual aspirations and possibilities, opportunities. So that's just what I'm talking about, of grappling with that with specific interlocutors when we're translating and reading. There's a certain kind of way in which there's a reason in a lot of contexts, not just in Buddhist context, it is really hard to talk about sex, gender, and sexuality because it's so deeply grounding. It brings people to earth. You have to deal with incredibly uncomfortable things that are masked and invisibilized, private, public, all those kinds of dichotomies in the West. There's also kind of the human, non-human issue we were talking about the gendered nature of deities and demons and the whole world there. But does gendering our analyses mundanize inherently? When you start to put, it just sort of brings to earth. It's so hard in English not to do that, such that you anthropomorphize Tibetan Buddhist divines. Even as they're like sex, they're markers that look like sex to us. And so I struggle as an anthropologist with what I call the Durkheimian gambit. You guys read Elementary Signs of Religious Life? I just taught it in Intro Anthro. But the gambit there is that the social scientist knows what symbols really mean. The totem, you may think it's divine, you may think it's this large divine thing, but I, the social scientist, know that it really means human society. Do you remember that part of the book where he says the totem means the clan? The totem just means the clan. These natives, they've got it all wrong, but they're really celebrating their clan, right? That's a Durkheimian gambit in any translation or interpretation, right? We really know what symbols really mean for people. That is, it's about gender or sex, you know. So that's just where I struggle, and anyway.
Can I ask Kevin a question?
Please.
I have a question too for this book.
But just because I'm very curious about it, but the great man in your studies and thinking about Buddhist Indian literature, where they've adopted not only the language of the military, but the language of royalty to describe the Buddha and so forth. So both royalty, both the top castes, you know, the Brahmin and the whole royal and military. And how much do you think was adopted in the Chinese Chan or the Confucian, which is I was always wondering, or both, or is that a huge universal? Is royalty a masculine universal, royalty and military?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because somehow, against my wishes, my book has turned into like 3 chapters about sovereignty. And I think that I really did not embark on this project. I started closer to masculinity and kept finding tropes of sovereignty. And I've developed this hypothesis that I don't know if anyone's going to accept at this point, that you have this idea that there are 2 generals fighting. It presupposes a battle either over sovereignty of some state or 2 rival states fighting. And it makes you think of, for example, the Buddha's, the attack of Mara on the Buddha. And there's all this martial language in Ashvaghosha. He says, Mara sees the Buddha meditating and says, that man is wearing the armor of forbearance and he's wielding the sword of wisdom. He's coming to take my domain, steal my domain from me. So it's an amazing scene, that people have talked about, that's like a sovereignty battle, Mara versus the Buddha. And I forget his name, Nichols wrote a book about Mara. He went to Northwestern.
Yeah.
What's his first name?
Oh, God. He was George Bond's student.
Michael?
I want to say Michael. Anyway, his book, he talks about how that story repurposed like stories of Indra battling someone. Indra is and the Buddha is Indra. But then what the Ashvaghosha does, or maybe it's other stories of the Buddha too, it casts it as all metaphorical, and he's not literally wielding a sword because it's the sword of forbearance, the sword of wisdom. So, but nevertheless, it's like it goes both ways. Yeah, it's still a sword image, and so to me, it seems like that kind of goes both ways. It's adopting a martial framework from those Indra stories or something to characterize what that looks like. So it's almost now. What's mysterious is in the Song Dynasty, Chan Buddhists, I think by and large recognized each other as legitimate. There's not evidence that that there was really a lot of antagonism among Chan masters. So this seems to be really a sort of ritual and literary type of theme, the martial battle. And so it invites the question, I think, even further of like, why were they saying that if it's not a reflection of actual social antagonism? And so it does seem to me, so my book is about how the various ways that Chan mastery was characterized as a kind of Buddhahood. And so it has slowly dawned on me that a lot of this stuff comes down to sovereignty language that imagines each Chan master battling over sovereignty, spiritual sovereignty. It doesn't totally make sense, you know? And it's also like, why didn't the Chan masters just vow to become Buddhas of their own Buddha field? It seems like they're battling, you know. And also, of course, you know, Chan master Linji says, if you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha. Why is he saying kill the Buddha? It's, you know, I have my own hypothesis about that, but it's like, it's a kind of assassination trope. There's this amazing thing in Chan literature where students will ask questions of the master, and one of the questions that you find in a bunch of records is someone saying, if you kill your mother and father, you go to the Buddha to repent. If you kill the Buddha, who do you go to repent to? So it's obviously like playing with this Linji, kill the Buddha thing in a way that seems to recognize that it's a fairly serious statement to make, to say, if you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha, even though that phrase has been interpreted as just metaphor. It clearly has a lot of force, rhetorical force. So I have thought of, anyway, I'm still thinking through this question of but I do think that it's related to the Buddha, you know, kshatriya, it's simultaneously a warrior and king. Yeah. So,
but isn't sovereignty also some masculine, subtly masculine assumption or something?
Definitely, yes.
And both, either one.
Right. It's definitely like kind of interwoven. Yeah. Thank you. But also, while I'm talking, sorry, Sarah, I wanted to just ask a question just about this like human and non-human, because I hadn't really thought of this before we started talking about, you know, is the Buddha a human, or what does it mean to represent the Buddha as a human? John Power's book is called The Bull of a Man, you know, and so on. You know, there's a question about whether masculinity humanizes a figure that, in a way that's inappropriate. But also, I was thinking, just because I think the concept of wrath, we don't really have the word wrath in Chinese Buddhism very much. I mean, it's just not as much of a theme. But in Tibetan Buddhism, like the wrathful deity is so important. So I'm just curious if wrath, first of all, if it's gendered. Right. You know, there are female deities that are wrathful, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an interesting question about what wrath means when it's performed by a living religious authority, as sort of a performance of Buddhahood or of wrathful divinity in a certain way. But it's also, it's a question for me whether or how that's gendered. Mm-hmm. If it's gendered, it seems to me that if there are wrathful deities, it's not inherently vulgarizing to say that figure is wrathful, but if you say that figure is angry, maybe it changes it or something. Like, I don't know where the line...
The way you translate it would make a huge difference.
Yeah, right.
Like the word wrathful in English has been really used to translate those kinds of relationships. Yeah. So we would use it, but it's not often used in colloquial English, right? We don't say, "Oh, you're so wrathful today." It's an elevating term. Yeah. It's like there's compassion behind your wrath and legitimacy.
Yeah, it's not okay to say the deity's angry, but it's okay to say he's wrathful.
Yeah. They invoke different things. Like they have different affective tones to them.
And I'm thinking the word zambu in Tibetan.
Yeah.
This made me think of that because it's also used in that the billboard in the Chinese.
I noticed that.
Zembichun in Ando. So like that is kind of powerfulness, but it also means ruler or authority, conqueror, but it's almost like a very legitimate form of forcefulness. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that the Chinese billboard used it different. So that's a different way of talking about what was happening in that thing versus the way the Chinese represented it, using a strong fist or heavy fist. It was legitimate law, using powerful law. We will go after these bad elements, kind of thing. So to talk about the Panchen Lama's speech as Zambo, is like it's wrathful in a way, but it's also very legitimate and authoritative. It's coming from a space of legitimacy.
And that billboard also had duel on it, right? Which is like a key tantric activity of subjugating, right? With wrath, which is almost exclusively the purview of male lamas. and was like famously what Guru Rinpoche had to do, right? So I think actually that the monastic and the tension between types of masculinity goes all the way back to the Pema Katang, because you have Shantarakshita showing up, and he explicitly says, "I don't have wrath. Drakpo me. We need someone with wrath. We have to invite, like, my peaceful methods of the Bodhisattva are not going to work. We have to invite a tantric master from India who has wrathful means available to him to come and do this, to come and tame this site in order to overcome this, in order to bring Buddhism to Tibet." And I actually, exactly, and I actually have an article on this coming out in a Buddhist Masculinities book that Kevin is the editor of, that I think is in final, that will be coming out soon.
2023,
It's just interesting that I thought that female wrathful figures are way more heavy duty. I mean, Dalai Lama riding on the saddle blanket made from the skin of her son, in an ocean of blood, carrying sickness bags, and I mean, it's
she is badass.
Could you? I'm like, fuck yeah! I'm like, we need more of that. Right?
That's like really, and I think I actually have always thought this represents some kind of male fear.
Yeah,
ultimately, the male fear of the feminine, like, wow.
I asked Kempola this question this summer because, so I think that John Powers makes a really crucial error in his book in thinking that the Buddha is a man, right? Because I think the Buddha occupies a different ontological state. I think it's not straightforward to just say the Buddha is a man. I think it's like a different thing going on. But that doesn't mean that Buddha is not gendered, right? Like, and that doesn't mean so Dokensei opens his entire, I've told a couple people in this room this story already, but he opens his entire Namtar with a story about a deity, a Golok deity, showing up, asking a man for help. The guy kills a demon with an arrow, and the Golok deity promises a reward. It's Amnyamachen, by the way. Promises a reward. But he's like, tomorrow the reward's going to come, and it's going to be really, really scary, and you have to be brave and just touch it on the head. And the next day it's a crocodile. It shows up. It's terrifying. And Longshantar, the archer, is so afraid that he just throws sand at it instead. That night, Amnyamachen comes again, an vision, and he says, "Kirang po mache song." Like, you did not do manness. You failed manness. Right, so this like gender extends in all of these ways beyond the human, and is mapped into the all of the tantric deities. Yabyum, that's like a male and a female. It extends way beyond the human. It's mapped onto the structure. It's metaphysical. It's mapped onto the structure of the cosmos itself, right? You can speak more to this, Khandrila, than I can with your Kanjanitic work, right? The layers of the construction of reality that come down from non-dual gnosis are deeply gendered. And I think that a more interesting question to me is when do you name it rather than are we creating it, right? So we're not creating out of whole cloth, right? I don't think that Western gender analysis is coming in and creating gender where it isn't. It's a question of the ethics of that operation, the ethics of that analysis.
Exactly. That's my point.
Yeah.
I'm really curious, in your work, if you will observe, is there any unacceptable violence for this narrative? Because we got, if your Lama says murder your people, then it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the story of the old dog, if your teacher's doing it to free of concepts, then it's okay. I was just reading a really interesting ethnography of what is considered abuse in Tibetan communities. For example, in this piece, talking about, if the mother-in-law breaks your arm, but you were being bad, it's not that, there isn't the emotional, the affective reaction of that as being inappropriate. And so, I think that could be a really interesting question, what's the scope of acceptable violence in even shock literature? What you're looking at is these are narratives meant to shock us.
Right, totally.
And so I'll be curious to see that. Is there some kind of violence that's not acceptable, or when is masculine violence acceptable?
I think that changes. I'm thinking of my work on Gaysar.
Yeah, right.
Gaysar, the whole epic is praised for his violence until the very end, when Yama says, you have lied to everyone about your abilities. You cannot do this. And kind of undermines the entire construction of the tantric subjugator. It says it's not real.
which is really interesting because Geisha shows up pervasively throughout Dokensei's Namtar, right? This is like a huge, like venerated male.
Right. Well, in my field work, when I try to talk with contemporary, with people in Golok and Yushu about this, they're like, oh, that didn't happen. And I will point to the text, like it says it right here, and they're like, well, that's wrong, that's not true. Geisha is this kind of tantric subject, and like, and so it's very interesting, like where the boundaries of what is like what you can even think, and like just what types of violence you can, or just like they're like, even if I have the text in front of them, they're like, that's not true, that's a lie.
And part of it is historical too. I think that it wasn't until the 19th century that you started to have the Chudrum, the Dharma Gesar tales. It wasn't fully incorporated, assimilated within Buddhism.
Maybe, I don't know. I get uncomfortable when we start saying that, like, our earliest Gesar he's already like a Buddhist figure in the 1760s, Shanghai, or the 1760s Mongolian Gesar in Beijing.
Oh, right.
So.
It makes me think just of a moment when Panchen Lama's own interpersonal violence was taken to be shocking. I had written about policing the boundaries of mandalic spaces in Cham, in monastic Cham. Lebrun, they had massive, they were wooden and painted and paper mache, clay animals, wrathful animals that would ride patrol, and they still do. Huge heads. I got hit by one of them. Just come up and they would literally use the head to smash you if you were out in the way or
get out of line.
And officials, monks would have switches and they'd be smashing, get people back when the ritual implements were being brought in. And that hurt. That hurt so bad. I was so kind of visible as this big white woman. He was like, yeah, smash her. But the Panchen Lama, when he went to do his tours, there'd be this crush of people crying, and just like he was a rock star. And then the local officials were smashing the crowd, just hitting and beating people back. And there were actually like people killed, falling apart. So he actually got incredibly wrathful and actually hit some of the comptrols, the officials, to say, stop this. This is unacceptable violence now. He sort of had a partly socialist mentality about this. Is what made him so unusual about the masses, about the respecting local commoners, right? And this is unacceptable anymore, right? So the stories about that violence are like shocking. It's sort of like now this kind of treatment of people as wrath is not seen. It's kind of shifting. Yeah.
Right. Sorry, we're basically at time. But I also saw Sarah's hand go up, and I was.
That's okay. No worries.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we can talk about this forever, right?
Yeah.
You actually have to listen to what I have to say. As my advisor, but
maybe to sum up the question. So you're sort of framing masculinity in liberation, and then we're talking so much about violence and wrath as a masculine trait. And it makes me think of my favorite Chinese Buddhist proverb: throw down your butcher knife, become a Buddha.
Yeah.
So like there's got to be stories of that. Like I'm a wrathful person. I'm putting down my wrath and becoming enlightened.
Yeah.
There is in Kondroning Teak. Yeah, Pamela itself says you should never hit anyone. You should not hit women. You cannot hit your consort.
Yeah.
So there are writers who were saying, "Do not be violent."
Yeah, for sure.
For sure. Okay.
But I just wonder, like at the moment of enlightenment, a wrathful person, someone famous for his violence, stops being violent and becomes Buddha. I mean, if that proverb is very prevalent, right, in Chinese Buddhism, so that trope must exist in Chan.
Yeah, I mean, butchery also just associated with vegetarianism and stuff. There's a sense of like renouncing that kind of. But then the skillful means of wrath might be a different category.
Yeah, right. Different ontological category too.
Category of excuse.
Speaking of food, thank you all so much. Yeah, I appreciate it.